Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all today. Before we move into the main event, just a few thank yous, because events like today's do not happen on their own. We are deeply grateful, as Grant mentioned, to the Rosencrantz family, whose generous support makes this gathering possible. To FSI, our home, in many ways related to this event, for hosting us in characteristic panache. To our truly wonderful staff who have worked diligently for a long time to make this event smooth, and to my co-conspirator in running this event, Grant Miller, who keeps me laughing as my next-door neighbor in my office. I'd also like to thank our incredible lineup of speakers from Spain to Brazil to California who have made today so far fascinating. And finally, it is my honor to introduce our keynote conversation. We're joined by Dr. Peter Piot, a towering figure in global health who needs little introduction. But nevertheless, let me tell you one anecdote that I found in the archives. Dr. Piot went to high school in a small town not far from Louvain in Belgium. He was the high school commencement speaker. Following his speech, he was to receive a medal for his high school accomplishments. Well, Dr. Piot decided to read from a speech by Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first president after its liberation from Belgium. Lumumba's speech denounced Belgium's history and oppressive and violent rule of the Congo. That didn't go over well with his high school. And the commencement was interrupted, and Dr. Piot never got his medal. However, he did establish himself as an advocate for justice in the world's poor. Dr. Piot went on to receive many medals for his work on Ebola and his visionary leadership of UNAIDS, the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I hope they give you the high school medal, Dr. Piot. In conversation with him is Dr. Ami Bhatt, one of our own physician scientists whose work bridges molecular biology, clinical care, and global health. She directs Stanford's Global Oncology Program, co-founded a nonprofit aimed at expanding cancer care in resource-limited settings, and leads a research lab investigating how the microbiome affects outcomes in cancer patients all together. She has taught and worked around the world, from Dublin to Gaborone, and is known for approaching both science and systems with equal parts of precision and imagination. Dr. Bhatt will join Dr. Piot on stage after his keynote address for conversation and audience questions. One final note before we begin, I would like to convey that we as a university recognize and value the right of individuals to express their views, and for this reason, disruptions that interfere with today's events are not permitted. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Piot and Ami Bhatt.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Aaron. I had completely forgotten, and by the way, I got the medal in the end, because it was for the best student of well, the state of Flanders, you know, from Flanders. Anyway, first of all, congratulations to the laureates here, you know, the prize winners. And this morning and this afternoon a bit, I could attend the symposium, and it's always a pleasure to hear young investigators and scientists, and with both the enthusiasm, the passion, and also the precision that we all need. It's always a pleasure to be back at Stanford. I just was reminded that in 2008 I gave a talk here, but I think that was probably not the first one. I can't count the number of times I've been here. But my greatest pleasure is to jog on the campus. That's through the beautiful campus. So when Aaron contacted me for this talk, it was, as the lawyers say, in tempore non suspectu, where we couldn't think of that, the fact what we're going through now in terms of the disruption, a very popular term in Silicon Valley, of global health. And don't worry, I'm not going to spend all the time here to be depressed or complain. I think that's a waste of time. We need to look forward and to see what we can do. And I've been given talks about what I called Global Health 2.0 for a few years' time, because I was convinced that even, without an abrupt crisis, we needed to change the paradigm and the way that we're working. And so this is what I will talk about a bit. Now, the term global health, I'm always interested in history, and being at the Freeman Spogler Institute also, it's an important dimension of understanding what's going on. And first of all, let me also pay tribute to three people. Of course, George Rosenkranz. And to be honest, I didn't know much about him, but I always look at the history, and his work really, from a chemist to be a game changer for women in the world. It's just remarkable, and so I feel very honored to be, to give a lecture under his name. But the two people I'd like to honor here are two, I would say, my two main mentors, with whom I worked in the last century in Seattle at the University of Washington, where Stanley Falco, the then future and past chair of Department of Microbiology, I worked in his lab. Even if most of my life I've been working on viruses, my PhD was actually on bacterial and bacterial pathogenesis. Stanley really taught me so many things. And maybe the most important one that is applicable also outside science is that he's always said, put yourself in the head of the microbe, think like a microbe. And that's extremely important also for whatever I've done, because I've been involved in extremely difficult negotiations and conflicts and all that. And I always try to put myself in the head of the other one. It's not always easy, and I don't pretend I was right, but so I'd really like to pay tribute to Stan, and he and Lucy are the people who actually were bringing me here in many years ago, before Michel Barry came here and others for global health. And then King Holmes, that was my clinical half, also in Seattle, and who's still there. I was still there. He passed away recently, and we will have in a few weeks' time a memorial. And and what's interesting, he's the reason that I actually drove from Atlanta, Georgia, to Seattle with only a handwritten letter. In these days, it was all okay. In 1978, so it's nearly 50 years ago. Because he was bringing science into a very neglected area, which was then called sexually transmitted diseases, now sexually transmitted infections, and so on, and in a multidisciplinary way. He was a clinician, but he worked also with Stanley and with social scientists, and we looked at the pathogens, but at the people and the behavior and immunology and all that. And he also mastered the art of making people work for him who were not paid for him and who had their own grants, which is also something I worked. So I'd like to really pay tribute. Without these two people, I don't think I would be where I am at the moment, and I could have done. Now, the term global health only appeared when you ask WeChat or whatever. Last century, it only pops up so like that global and health are in the same sentence, but not global health. It's only around the millennium. And my entry in global health, if I may say so, was driven by serendipity when I was in training for clinical microbiology and clinical infectious diseases, but there was at the time in clinical virology. In these days, virology was like cooking. something I love enormously. So was no difference. The difference is that when a virologist or microbiologist cooks, the kitchen is absolutely clean. But it was like putting a sample on cells and then injecting mice and so on. And nothing like PCR or whatever. And it took all a long time. So I was then working at the Institute of Tropical Medicine in Antwerp in Belgium, because it was the only place where you could combine this, clinical and lab, and I never really was able to choose, even if I ended up in public health, for which I have no degree at all. We got two samples in glass tubes. Everything was in glass in 1976. Coming from, was then called Zaire, Kinshasa, and with a small piece of paper, yellow fever, fièvre jaune in French, question mark was the clinical diagnosis. And in these days, in Congo, in Zaire, it was not possible, there was no capacity to isolate viruses. Today, at the National Institute for Biomedical Research, they do sequencing, they're really super well equipped. And that's very illustrative of the progress that we've made, not only on the science, but also in the capacity. So to make a long story short, we were the first one, we isolated Ebola virus in '76, and because we just did the regular viral isolation techniques in an environment that today we would characterize maybe as 2.5, BSL 2.5, something like that, and this is for the amateurs a P4 pathogen. So we had to stop, and we sent it then the samples, the isolates, which contains, for those who don't know, but that's billions of viral particles by something like DHL, I don't remember, to Atlanta, to CDC, which was the only civil P4 lab in the world. The only three ones were military labs in the Soviet Union, in England, and in Fort Detrick here. And they could confirm through immunofluorescence, not a very sophisticated test, that this was not Marburg virus, but Ebola. So that's a story how I got into global health, because that allowed me to go to Africa. Today would be impossible. I would not check any box. I'd never investigated an epidemic. I'd never worked in Africa. But there were no other volunteers who were ready to go. So I could go and join an international team chaired by the Minister of Health of Zaire and by Professor Jean-Jacques Muyembe, who's on the top floor, who was the first one who actually saw a patient. And so that's, thanks to that, I ended up in Atlanta, CDC. But CDC in these days, there was not much interest in global health at all. So I ended up in Seattle, okay, and then went back home. And then another virus popped up in my life in the early 80s, which we now call HIV. Didn't have a name. But in Antwerp, there was in the hospital for infectious diseases, we started seeing patients with a uniformly fatal illness full of opportunistic infections, and all coming from Central Africa. This was in the early 80s, 81, 82, so. And then when the first reports appeared from the US, about what we call now AIDS, we said, it looks like it, but we had one big difference, and that is that 1/3 of our patients were women. And it was clear from the beginning that this was a viral infection, and so on. And, but the dogma was this is a so-called gay disease with the awful name GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. And I could not understand why a virus would care about the sexual orientation of a human host. This is in our head, but not in the head of the virus. Remember what I said about Stanley Falco. And so we did what as the right thing to do, went to Kinshasa, where most of the patients came from, both Africans and expats. And there in Hôpital Mamayemo, which is the big public health hospital, found that the male and female wards of internal medicine were full of patients with this syndrome, of my age in these days. and cryptococcal meningitis. I mean, just name it, and they will all die. And that was a aha erlebnis in my world, in the sense, I said, this is what I want to do. This is going to be a terrible heterosexual epidemic. The problem is several journals rejected it because, and I regret I didn't keep the letter, because these days was letter from the New England Journal of Medicine, where the reviewer said, one sentence, it's a well-known fact that AIDS, quote unquote, cannot be transmitted from women to men. And therefore, forget it. But in the end, you know, we know what happened. So this was the beginning of the first HIV research program in Africa with the Projet SIDA, with Jonathan Mann, who was leading it, and Dr. Bilakapita. And it was an interesting collaboration between NIH and CDC. And we at the Institute of Tropical Medicine in the Congolese, we were there often to, how to say, as the therapist between CDC and NIH interests. But it really laid the foundations for a lot of what we know about HIV in Africa, the heterosexual transmission, the fact that tuberculosis is following HIV as its shadow. The first time also that we could demonstrate that condoms protect was in a study what was then called still prostitutes, sex workers. And also in my lab, Martin Peters found that a virus that was 97-8% homologous with the HIV-1, but was isolated from a chimpanzee in Gabon. And that was, we know today that this is the ancestor. HIV is a zoonosis just as Ebola, just as influenza, and etc. And we did a lot of research on that. Again, the original papers were first rejected. He said it's lab contamination, which of course is possible. But I told them that we also share about 96-7% homology with chimps as human beings. But so this was for me the entrance in what we call today in global health. But there was not that much real interest. It was all looked as something exotic. And I think it's HIV that really changed it. And after some time in academia and so on, and clinical medicine, and where every single of my patients died because there was no treatment, just to remind people that these days, I started at UNAIDS. I never had thought in my life that I would become a UN bureaucrat. But this was an effort that was pushed for as a creation, as a new entity by the most affected countries in the world. In these days, HIV in certain African countries had become a true development problem. There were millions, literally millions of people who died, and in some countries it devastated also the educated people and so on. And UNAIDS was created, and it was created in '95, and in '96 it was announced that HIV infection is a treatable condition, not cure, but treatable. It was a huge, breakthrough. But at that conference in Vancouver, I said we should not rest until this treatment becomes available to everybody who needs it. Because then the price was about $14,000 per person per year. In current rates, I made that maybe 30,000. I don't know. I'm not an economist. So, and that took much longer than I thought, including because of the huge resistance of the public health community against this. They said, in Africa, the no health system, the no health services. So in these days, you needed to have take your drugs at very precise times. People would get up at night and so on, and that's not possible. And this is a quote that's very typical for that area from the chief economist at the World Bank. And I must say that he changed his mind afterwards, his credit. But the brutal fact was that those who could pay for Africa's AIDS therapy, the pharmaceutical industry by way of price cuts, and rich country taxpayers by way of foreign aid, are very unlikely to do so. I'd like to mention that because this is also in light of the current conversations where we are. But never, accept, never say no, and, sorry. it really led to a massive movement. And the major advantage from a political perspective of HIV, of AIDS, is that it affects populations both in high-income countries and in low-income countries. So that means a few things. One, there is a market, commercial market, business, but on the other hand also there is a kind of solidarity across geopolitical divisions and so on, because it affects everybody. Very different from, let's say, malaria or schistosomiasis, we heard about it, and so on. But I hope that other things have become universal now. I'll talk about it, like chronic conditions, diabetes, certain cancers, and so on. And it's really the AIDS movement that gave birth to global health. Around the millennium, after several years as head of UNAIDS, I felt a total failure because we had not made any progress. The number of people killed by HIV increased every single year. We were at some point 2.5 million per year, 3 million. New infections were enormous. And so I convened a meeting, kind of a non-meeting would be impossible in the era of social media today. There's no report, no notes on it, nothing, because the temptation was not even there to tweet or to do it. And so I said, okay, we're a failure, what do we do, how to do? And the conclusion of that meeting was where I had invited friends, but also people who were very critical of what I'd been doing. And the conclusion was at the end of the day, there are only in big in politics and so on in the world, only two matters that really matter. And that is the economy, money, and security. So we need to redefine HIV in that term, and we need to bring the issue there, rather than just talk among ourselves. And again, I think the Freeman-Spokely is well placed to bring that kind of dimension in. And so that's what I did, and brought it to the UN Security Council. You can see here this was the first meeting of the millennium. It was dedicated to AIDS. We have my boss, Kofi Annan, and there you can see Al Gore was then vice president. And in the Security Council, the members have, there's a rotating chair. Every month is a member, and the only thing that a member can do is really propose some, topics for the agenda. And the US had then, thanks to Ambassador Holbrooke, had, proposed to HIV, and the angle was peacekeeping operations. So we put it at the top level of security in the, the UN General Assembly in 2001. Actually, it was a special session. And also to the World Economic Forum in Davos. These were all fora that were completely new to me. And that was probably not such a bad thing, because I could go on and there, and I could then ask for forgiveness or whatever when I violated the rules. But it really put HIV on the agenda, and I wrote a book on it about where I discovered that in order to achieve something, that science is not enough. If science is not really connected to good politics, then you can't have an impact. But of course, we know also that politics that's not based on science can be very dangerous also. So that led to really major impact. We had the Global Fund to Fight AIDS-TB Malaria that came out of this the UN General Assembly, and with particularly Kofi Annan and President Obasanjo from Nigeria was key in mobilizing the African states through the Organization of African Unity, now African Union. And then President Bush in 2003 launched PEPFAR. The Gates Foundation was established and was also investing in HIV. And that led to a serious increase in funding. You can see here, it was very slowly going up. And also the price of antiretroviral, this is an example for Uganda, came down from $12,000 to about $300 per person per year through various actions. We're squaring the circle. We didn't want to kill innovation, and on the other hand, you wanted to have, access. And there was a combination of factors of diplomacy, activism, new patent rules in India, the Indian generic manufacturers, and also the differential pricing and so on. So we came to a new social pact, which is still unique, to be honest. And that led to then a decrease in the number of deaths you can see, and as the money went up for it. So this is a bit of, I thought, starting with history. Now, this is about 25 years ago, beginning of the millennium that this starts. We are now 2025, and we are, I think, at a turning point when it comes to global health and a few other things. When you look at what has been happening, it may be that in terms of global health, we've had a quite unique momentum in history, maybe 25 years. And again, as you can see, this is what's called Development Assistance for Health, is the acronym. So it's fairly flat, and then slowly increasing the millennium, and then went up and up and up. And then here, this is COVID, it's an abnormality, and then it starts going down, and now we already know that for 24 it was major decrease, and for this year even more. And you can see that a major part of that is driven by HIV, but not everything. And so the question now is, where will this land? Will this land at this level or at that level? And I can assure you that it will make a difference for people's lives. Because here, when you look at some key indicators of, it's too much on this slide, but for various health outcomes, maternal mortality, TB, HIV, under 5 mortality, huge, look at that. It's a huge decrease. Malaria incidence going up again, but HIV incidence, TB, this is only incidence, but also mortality. And so it really has had an impact, but it's an unfinished business. The UN development goals, so first Millennium Goals, they call for elimination, eradication, and zero this and that. I never, to be honest, believe that. It's a absolute, it's just not realistic. Maybe because I worked a lot on some infections that are still around. Only smallpox has been eradicated. Look, polio, we've been doing the last mile for the last 25 years. Doesn't mean it won't be possible, but to be realistic. But anyway, so we have targets, and then you see that these are from the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation in Seattle, and you can see these are the various scenarios depending on investments. Now, and a downward trend is the good one, but none of them will really reach the target, and it's even more unlikely now with the current crisis. And we have 2 that are, I think, hard to believe, but maternal deaths continue to be quite high, and including in some high-income countries, including in this country in some places. So the old agenda, to say so, is not over, but there is a new agenda. And regardless of the current crisis, we needed to change. Now, when you look at it, what were the drivers of this, besides the political momentum that I mentioned, where countries across geopolitical sectors came together, high-income and low-income countries, East, West, and so on, which is, given what the polarized world of today is quite remarkable. That means it's possible. But there was, on the one hand, innovation. There were a number of new vaccines, for example, affordable vaccines that could be, applied on a very large scale. And this is where Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, which was established, was really, instrumental. HIV treatment, I mentioned. Imagine without that, then where we would be. I mean, millions of people would have died in the meantime. Malaria tools also, something as, how to say, sounds very stupid, but a bed net treated with insecticides. I mean, hard to imagine something more simple, how many lives it can change. And then the establishment, as I said, Gavi, the Global Fund, PEPFAR, etc. All this has played a major role. But then came COVID. And with COVID, we had, on the one hand, a true global pandemic. Pan means, by definition, the world. And that probably killed well over 20 million people, far more than what WHO officially reports. But it led to two things, I would say. One, realizing that the huge level of inequity in terms of, in this case, access to vaccines. And on the other hand, a breakdown of trust in science, in public health, and so on. And we're living with these consequences. Now, never miss a good crisis, I would say, and I think there are some positive things that came out of it. On the access to vaccines, there was an initiative called COVAX, and that was based on the fact that Indian vaccine manufacturers would provide the vaccines particularly for Africa, because the rest of the world made vaccines elsewhere. But then India was confronted with a huge COVID epidemic, which killed millions of people with dramatic shortage of oxygen and so on. And Prime Minister Modi then banned the export of vaccines and said we need them themselves. And first I was angry, but then I remembered Stanley Falco and I said, what would I have done myself? I said, I would have done exactly the same thing. You know, I'm elected by Indians and not by Africans and so on. So it will always be the case. I'm glad that there is some pandemic treaty, but I don't think that in cases of this kind of extreme national security that will make a difference. So my conclusion was what we need to do is to make sure that this vaccine manufacturing and production is available where the vaccines are needed. On the trust issue, Heidi gave a talk about it yesterday, but I'm concerned that that's not going to go away. And so I believe that we are much better prepared for the next pandemic on the technical level, but at the societal level, it may be worse than before. So we're going into multiple transitions, and that's the last part of my talk. And that's, in a way, big success, I would call a dirty word for some, but international solidarity. And we see some, I would say, positive changes. I mean, there's a huge socioeconomic development in the MICs. You know, before coming here, we were in India. When you look at cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad, and you know what's going on in terms of innovation, or in China. So it's not just copying and manufacturing; it's also through innovation. This really socioeconomic development, which of course we all know is one of the biggest promoters of health. It's not biomedical interventions. Secondly, of course, and that is more negative, geopolitical power changes that I won't go into that, but conflicts. In Europe, we have the war in Ukraine that is absorbing a lot of energy and money. Domestic political shifts with political parties who are against international collaboration and global health. But on the positive side, again, we have biotech and digital health, and I'll come back to that. A lot of innovation, these are opportunities. We have centers of excellence in research and innovation. I mentioned the fact that in a huge country like Congo, the DRC, that they were not able to isolate viruses. Well, there are now centers of excellence across Africa, certainly in Asia and Latin America. But also, the world is changing. We live longer, there's demographic transition, epidemiological transition, I'll come back to that, and then there's climate change and so on. So all things you know, I don't tell you anything new. And I would say that this global demographic transition and transformation is going to be huge, with major impacts. It's it's coming from East Asia, but it's now everywhere, also Europe, except in West and Central Africa, where there's still very high birth rates, but also there's already longer life. And that has a lot of implications, not only that in a few decades, the US will no longer be the third most populous country in the world, it will be Nigeria, and so on. So that has a lot of implications. And in Europe, and we know that here in this country, there's been a collapse of support for global health. Let's hope that some of it can be saved. But it's not a unique trend. In US, when you look at the EU, at Europe, and I was a special advisor to Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, who, by the way, spent quite some time here at Stanford. You know, she is a medical doctor, an obstetrician, but has a master's in economics. And before going to politics, spent time here. It's not well known, but I think you can be proud of her as well, together with her husband, who was a cardiologist, or is, sorry, you know that. So we already saw a 9% decrease in official development assistance last year. But then new governments have come on, and also, as I mentioned, the increase in defense spending because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. UK slashed its ODA budget by 40%, and then Germany 12% as a beginning, and will continue. And you can see the figures here: France, Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, and others. So it's defense, it's domestic political shift, like in the Netherlands, where some of the very right-wing populist parties are against this kind of budgets. And then also in some countries like the UK, they actually use ODA to pay for refugees and so on. So the budget is not decreased officially, but what it's been used for is for home. At the European level, there is something that's called the Global Gateway, which originally was for particularly to support infrastructure partnerships, mostly in Africa, but also in Latin America and parts of Asia. But it's been used to support vaccine manufacturing in Africa, with an allocation of about 1.1 billion euro, so that's more or less the same in dollars. And that has gone in the first place to Senegal, to South Africa, Rwanda, and a bit in Ghana. And so that is paying for the capex and for really the initial investments, which are always very hard to find. And then also on green hydrogen deals and so on. And what's interesting also is that some of the development banks, and the World Bank, but on the European side, they are now expanding their activities in sub-Saharan Africa, and that may compensate for it. But the truth is that, particularly for something that I worked on a lot, of course, and still I'm passionate about, is HIV. And when you look at a number of African countries, you see the dependency on international funding, and that's in red is PEPFAR. So here, and then the rest is other international funding. That's the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria. And it seems that it shows that a major percentage of treatment and of funding for HIV treatment and prevention is really coming from outside. Years ago, I gave a talk about I have to stop now? Is that? Okay, sorry. About the fact, can you call a country sovereign when 90% of the people on HIV treatment are, the funding depends on a foreign vote. So, but it means that if that funding abruptly goes down, then people will die. It's as simple as that. Now, there are 4 points before closing that I'd like to mention that give me really where I think the future is, and rather than to be depressed and leave that aside, angry while you take the shower, and then go for, see what we can do. And one is really, and certainly here in Silicon Valley, that I think that AI and also biotech will be huge opportunities for leapfrogging. Compare it to the mobile phone. Many low-income countries still don't have landlines, but there is all money transactions. They were pioneers in that, like Kenya was the pioneer for M-Pesa. For that is something that's one thing. Secondly, we see with COVID an emergence of the regions, not just the global stuff, but in Africa, Africa Centers for Disease Control, CARICOM, Europe, and so on. And I'm confident that this year we'll see the first vaccines roll out of the manufacturing facility in Dakar, in Senegal. It's based at the Institut Pasteur de Dakar, but there will be others. So that is really, and will be a challenge. There will be many failures. Commercially, it's going to be a challenge, but I think it's really a major step forward. 3 is that there is a renewed interest in domestic funding. And again, it will be very hard in the short term to compensate for the loss of funding, and that will cause deaths. There's no doubt about that. But the problem is, for many countries, they have a huge debt burden, and how that limits their fiscal space. And so there is something that a renewed interest. I'm not going to go into into details here, but there are a number of initiatives emerging, particularly in Africa, to do that. Asia has been on that trajectory for a long time. I was in Delhi in 2004 when the government then decided to no longer accept foreign development funding for its regular activities. And that was a very wise decision in these days. But of course, you have to come up with it. And then 4th is that we need really urgent reform of the global health architecture, even without this crisis now. At the moment, there's the World Health Assembly in Geneva for the WHO. I'm sure they will talk about it, but it's far more than that. That simply we need to go to some far more efficient system, which will require some M&A, some mergers and acquisitions, and break down the silos, better integration. The Global Fund and Gavi and UNITAID, they will have to join forces, have the same cycles for funding to countries and all that. So we need to, it's a matter of not only more efficiency, but also to be far more embedded in country priorities rather than top-down. And we can talk about that later. So what keeps me awake at night? Truly, this war, conflict, I can tell you that. Without that, we won't make progress. And there is, of course, a collapse, major support in this country, in global health, but also in European countries, and we'll see how to manage that. I think it's manageable over several years, but it's the acute crisis that is the biggest problem. This breakdown of trust in science and health, public health, polarization. There is also, when you look at it from a business perspective, a decline in investment in infectious diseases innovation in a big way, and also drug and vaccine development. I think we will see an increased risk of spillover in epidemics, and I would say a lack of ambition. But I'm an optimist, and I see leadership emerging in so many places, these regional initiatives. I think the innovation is going to make a big difference. The leapfrogging, when it just comes to HIV, soon in a few years, we may have even one injection a year that can prevent HIV. It's fantastic. And also the announcement by Bill Gates last week that to spend $200 million over 20 years. Not that will solve everything, but that's kind of all indicators. So that's what I like to say. And to conclude, for my 65th birthday, then you know my age now, went back to Yambuku, where the first Ebola epidemic was known, and to see how it's going. It was pretty depressing, that one, because the situation was much worse than 50 years ago. The man you see here, Sukato, is a survivor of Ebola. He runs the laboratory, and this is the hospital lab. This is the equipment. That's all you see. And it was, the basic health system and social and poverty are such a degree that it's very, very hard to make any progress without at the same time also working on socioeconomic development. Thank you, and sorry that I spoke for too long. Thank you.
All right, So thank you very much for that really fantastic presentation. You have led a very exciting and illustrious life, accomplishing so much from science to medicine to global policy. For many of us, we've read your stories, we've heard about you, we've seen you speak on YouTube or listened to your podcasts, and it's really a gift to be able to ask you some questions today. So I would like to know what was one of the luckiest early decisions that you made in your career? Or one of the best early decisions you made?
I think not to say no when they asked me to go to Congo to go and work on Ebola. I mean, if I would have really thought it through, but I was 27. I would have. I mean, I was not. As I said, I didn't tick off any of the boxes. That's the bureaucratic answer. But I was, on the one hand, a bit scared, but I was so great. And that put in place a lot of things. Another one I would say is that to go to Seattle, which in these days, pre-Microsoft, there was one Starbucks, pre-Amazon, and so on. But I mentioned Stan Falco and so on, but again, and not knowing that the Gates Foundation would be there, etc. I mean, these are, I think, how to say, serendipity and not making a long list of the pros and cons of the decision, but just go for it, I think. Yeah, I'm not sure if I had to take these decisions today, I would do the same ones. But.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot to be said for just going with your gut sometimes.
Yes,
yes. And not overthinking things.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that you and I both share a mentor, Stan Falco. He wasn't my formal mentor, but when I came here as an assistant professor, he was one of the first people to welcome me. And I also like to think about it from a microbes perspective, since that's what Stan taught me. But one of the really beautiful things about Stan that I think you also embody is he was an extremely accomplished person, but he also had a huge amount of humility. You know, it was amazing that he would welcome an assistant professor into his office and take you seriously and want to hear your perspective. So one of the things that I think is really impressive if you're in your position is you get to meet a lot of people, and you also get to meet a lot of young people. So tell me a little bit about what you're learning from the younger generation of people you get to interact with today.
Today. Yeah, first I should say that maybe I'm 76 now, and that what gives me the greatest joy are the people who, trained with me, worked with me, I could mentor and so on without using that term, and who then are in all kinds of positions all over the world, and be it in an NGO or being a minister or leading PEPFAR. John Kengasong did his PhD with me, and so many people. And that gives me the greatest joy, in a sense. And but of course, it's their merit, it's not me. But it's also across the world. And yeah, I always, my mantra is in a sense that nobody is rich enough not to learn from someone else, and nobody is poor enough not to have something to offer, you know. What I'm looking for is a combination of real life experiences and then a new look at it. And with young people today, I mean, I still try to follow a lot of the lab work. And so microbiome is one of my things. Because with Stan, one of the things I worked on was bacterial vaginosis, but that was before today we know microbiome. I was obsessed by finding the single cause.
Sure. Which
was, of course, we know I wasted my time completely. But but it's to understand, you know, new ideas, and that they challenge me. But also I try in that dialogue to we destabilize each other in a sense, because sometimes the least you know, the more certain you are about what you're saying, and maybe the other way around also, I don't know. So trying to, and then today I would say AI and so on. I can use it, but to be honest, I think I don't exploit maybe 95% of what it could be, but I think I'm more interested in a combination of learning from other disciplines like economics and you know, more the social science, also contaminated by Heidi, my anthropologist wife. But also, I'm fascinated by the molecular type of level, particularly in neuroscience. And so I want to try. I'm one of those people, I love to read like Nature and Science, but to have it in my hands. And I can, because that's how I see, oh, that's it. If I would only go for, a keyword about the stuff I'm working on, I would never learn about things that that are irrelevant maybe, but I think people, I think it's probably true for everybody here, but curiosity is a big driver of what I'm doing. And the unknown. Otherwise, I find it a bit boring.
Yeah, well, it seems like you are anything but boring.
No, but...
So it seems like curiosity has really enriched your life. And, here we are at Stanford University. We have lots of fantastic departments, but we often feel like there are barriers and walls between the different parts of campus. Rarely do we have this type of meeting where people who are, card-carrying economists are talking with people who are infectious disease epidemiologists. So what are some of the things that we can do as a community to lower barriers to interdisciplinary conversations, to really demonstrate curiosity about each other's work when, especially in the halls of academia, there's a lot of pressure, I think, to dig ever deeper into your narrower and narrower field of interest?
I think first you could launch a whole research to identify the gene for territoriality and,
And then create an inhibitor, yeah.
Yes, because I think there must be it's so general. Anyway, I wasn't serious, but no, I think we have a lot of rhetoric about transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary work, but then when you write a proposal, it comes in the hands of a review committee of people who think, that's not to criticize them, but in their discipline. And you send it to a journal, and it's the same story. So there's a really need. Where are the incentives for going across borders? But I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, but many years ago, I was fascinated by. And they were constructing a new building here. BioX, is that possible?
Yes.
Yes, right. And I visited, I talked to people. And what I was interested in was that the architecture was designed to kind of force people to run into each other from different disciplines. And it came from another university on the other side of the country where the same institute didn't achieve that. So I think it is... the way I see it is that I start from the challenge, the question, and the problem. And when I came to the U.S., I had I was 28 or so, 29, and I had very high expectations that in the U.S., that here at the university, you would know so much better, so much more than I. And actually, I found out no, that's not true. I went to medical school, working PhD. No, but the way you're organizing. And I think there's far more cross-disciplinary, fertilization than elsewhere, and also because of bigger groups. And today I expect the most from the interaction between physics, biology, and AI. And so that together. And maybe AI will bring it together as long as we don't abdicate and we leave it to AI. I think that would be a disaster, because by definition, unless they come to really generative one that fully it's by definition built on what we already know. And Bill Gates gave an interview and he said that he identified a few fields where AI would never replace it. And one was biology, he said. The other was sports, and the third one, I can't remember what it was. But so I don't have a magic solution, but the first obstacle I often find is respect, a lack of respect. Many disciplines feel that what their discipline is superior to the others. And you can have that within life sciences, vis-a-vis others, social sciences, they look down, etc. and all that. Secondly, is language. The same term means different things in different disciplines. So I think maybe one has to make some sand pits, you know, where you can play around. But when you take your field, you can't solve the problems that are so complex with just one discipline. And so where do we bring together? And in general, it's the people who are more confronted with the realities and look from there that you are forced to work together and say, oh boy, I should ask. So do you know someone in, I don't know, genetics or economics or what, or medicine? And that's, when look at, for example, today, I don't know about this country, but I hope it's the same in Belgium, the cancer treatment is not by law, but by incentives, the work of interdisciplinary teams.
Yes.
It's, you know, that's a must for the in our healthcare system. 10 years ago was unthinkable. Either you fell in the hands of a surgeon or or whatever, you know, which organ you had. But maybe I'm just thinking aloud. For a university, is certainly at the level of maybe certainly at graduate education to have people, you know, be confronted with the realities. Even if you are in a very basic science thing, some programs there that cost money, but and I think that Stanford has a lot of international collaborations and partnership. But I wonder whether they're partnerships. There's a big difference.
There is.
And so not just okay, we met each other at that conference, great X, and then we have a joint program and so on, although now with NIH that's no longer possible maybe, but still. And then try to sit down and go where the problems are. But it's something that really I've been trying so much in my life. When I was head of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, I created a number of centers around an issue. For example, and two principles. One, that it was always a co-chair, because we had lots of the groups, people working in, you know, mostly in Africa and some in India and so on, and that it would always be a co-chair from London and someone from somewhere in the world, but all faculty. That was one. And then two, it had to be multidisciplinary. For example, the Antimicrobial Resistance Center, the first chairs was a microbiologist and an anthropologist. But I must say, this was a top-down decision. This was not something that came out spontaneously. But I really wanted to force it. And in some cases it worked, and in others not.
It was a good experiment then.
Yeah, yes, but not a randomized one.
Absolutely.
Yes, not a placebo-controlled.
Yes. You know, it's interesting you described the role of, you know, physical space, you know, at BioX, for example. It reminds me a lot of the kind of city health challenges, where I think we're increasingly appreciating that the physical place that we live and how our lives are structured make a lot of health decisions for us. They are a major part of our social determinants of health. And you've also described cultural aspects that impact how we interact with one another and how we can lower the barriers to interaction. You know, one of the things that really impressed me during the COVID pandemic was, I think TED Med had asked you 100 questions about COVID. And it's a rapid fire. If you haven't seen it, it's pretty good. It's 100 questions, rapid fire, and the precision and the simplicity with which you provided answers was something that really honestly took my breath away, because you made it very clear what this virus was, what the risks were, what the challenges were, in a way that appealed to me as a biologist and a physician and a scientist, but also could appeal to somebody who had no biology background whatsoever. So I think you're demonstrating in a way in that interview some of what you're talking about, which is, you know, let's get rid of the jargon and communicate clear ideas.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. That's true.
Yeah, it's a good one. So, you know, you could check it out too.
I hope there were not too many stupid things, because sometimes you simplify, but...
No, there were no stupid things. I checked the whole thing, so
Okay.
yeah, I looked at it again, before I brought it up.
Yeah.
But I think, I think part of the reason you can speak with such simplicity and honesty is because you're very open to the idea of being challenged. And I think an example of that is you brought up when UNAIDS was flailing or failing, as you said, in the early years. You brought not only your colleagues and your supporters, but also your critics to the table. So tell me a little bit about what inspired that idea to bring all kinds of people to the table, and how you structured that type of interaction to make it productive.
I think it's partly cultural. So where I come from, it's not good taste to show up and so on. So you have to, and I'm pretty tough for myself also. So that's, but I mean, you have to never forget, why are you doing something? And in the case of UNAIDS was to save lives. And so that means that the only indicator, the only KPI is the number of people who die. And when that goes up, then I say, I'm a failure. I mean, and then I hope there's someone better who can deal with it. But I always hope that others have better ideas. And then, and it's through dialogue. And but how to do? I just invited them. It was near Lake Annecy, and I said, the conditions are totally open, no records, nothing. I mean. You can talk about it, but it has to be discreet, and everybody respected it, which was, as I said, in today's world, I don't think it would be possible to do that. And yet, for very complex things, I would say a public conversation may not be the best way to do it, because people will not say what they think, or it's they make statements, and we don't need statements. We need, I can change my mind while I'm talking to you. But I think that's the base of science, no? And also, I'm a strong believer that in order to have a society that benefits most of the members, that we need to, to understand each other and to talk and to find a solution that is the negatively, the least bad for everybody or the best for everyone. But for me, it's actually it was not an issue. I don't know how to. Yeah. But I think that key is to keep your the long-term goal. That's, for me, is very important. So does everybody know chameleons? Yeah. Have you seen chameleons? So I talk about it in my book, No Time to Lose. And the person who became my successor in UNAIDS, Michel Sidibé, is from Mali. And he was telling that in his ethnic group, the boys when they're 12 or so, I think, when they're going to be circumcised, they have to spend 24 hours or so with a chameleon, and they're so in the bush, and have to come back and tell what they saw. And of course, when you say about someone is a chameleon, it's not a compliment. So I'll say that changes color. But so to make a long story short, when you see a chameleon, the head is like this and doesn't feel. So keep a long-term goal. That's very important. Secondly, changes color. But that's if you just change color, you don't have a long-term goal, you're an opportunist. But if you change color to reach your goal, you adapt. And then eyes of a chameleon go 180 degrees. So times 2 is 360. So intelligence all the time, you have to, what else was there? And then, the chameleon, they go on this one step at a time, like this. It's also, shortcuts can work sometimes, but, and finally, the most important body organ of a chameleon, what is it? Is the tongue, because they feed themselves. If the tongue comes out too early, no fly, or it's too late, the fly is gone. So the food. So timing is everything. Okay. So when I'm in a difficult, in a complex situation, I always think, what would a chameleon do? I'm not joking, but it's.
I don't think anybody's going to forget that. I'd like to invite the audience to ask some questions if you have any. I know you probably have many. Please just raise your hand, and somebody will bring a mic to you. We have one in the back in the center.
Hi, thank you so much. I really appreciated your remarks and also your optimism about particularly the 200 billion from the Gates Foundation. But I'm really interested about sort of what that means in terms of another cliff in 2045 of funding and how you are thinking about ways in which everyone around the world, but particularly the Gates Foundation, should be spending money in the next 20 years to ensure that we don't fall off another funding cliff and have sustainability beyond that.
Yeah, when I was, I mean, I'm an optimist, but also a realist. I know that there's a huge funding crisis at the moment. And yeah, I'm not Bill Gates, so I have to ask him what we'll do with his money. But what I think is to say the reason I like it, one, it's serious money. And 20 years commitment in today's world, that's like eternity. I mean, not for you, but for me, I'll be dead probably. And that means about 9-10 billion a year. That's a lot of money and not much money. I mean, when you think what PEPFAR has been, using. But I think that knowing Bill Gates a bit, it's going to be a lot for innovation in global health and making sure that as many people as possible benefit from that innovation. Could be new vaccines, it could be also innovation in delivery and so on. So, and that it's really also accessible for people in low-income countries and the poorest. But I think that where we have to make a difference also is making all the mechanisms more efficient and more driven by the needs of the communities, of the countries. They should be in the driver's seat and set the agenda. So finding that, in a sense, compromise of local action and local policy setting, and on the other hand, the contribution of global action. I mean, that interaction is going to be crucial so that we can have the best. But the Gates Foundation can have that impact if there are systems to use it. I mean, that's why I ended with a bit of a depressing view. If you, let's say, okay, HIV, there are now you can really, it's a game changer. You can, within a cup of here, I know I'm not allowed, I think, to mention any drug, but anyway, there's only one. So with one drug, that you can prevent 100% in the trials the acquisition of HIV in women every 6 months, and there's a good indication every year. That really could lead to nearly ending HIV. But that's only possible if the price is affordable, if there are systems to deliver it, and so on. And there may soon be other drugs like once-a-month oral, etc. We have the GLP-1 antagonists who maybe become like statins, and if they're affordable, that also could, deal with huge issues, and because like obesity, diabetes, and so on, no longer high-income country type of problem. But I'm optimistic for it because I hope that kind of statement is contagious. There is Bill Gates launched many years ago the Giving Pledge among fellow billionaires, and I don't remember the exact terms, but I think to give away 90% of your wealth during your life or something like that. Well, there are quite a few who do it. There are others who haven't given a cent and who could, and have even more money than he has. Yeah.
Maybe in the back.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the fantastic presentation. My name is Mary from Kenya, the University of Nairobi in Kenya, here through the Stanford African Scholars in Global Health Partnership, founded by, thank you, Asante Sana, founded by Prof. Michelle Barry at the Stanford Center for Innovation in Global Health. So my question is around, one of your slides rightly showed that 30% of the HIV funding for Kenya comes from PEPFAR.
Yes.
So of course, with the current shocks, with PEPFAR funding, we've managed to get the prevalence of HIV down from a high of 13% in the 90s. We're now down to 3%. So my question to you would be, what advice would you give the Kenyan Minister of Health or the Minister of Finance going forward? I'd love to pick your fantastic brain on what you think we can do in the current challenging financial realm. Thank you so much.
No, thank you very much, Santisana. So I think that Kenya overall has done quite a good job in terms of HIV in general. And one of the reasons is that there was a very decentralized approach. Every country had a strategy that was driven by the local epidemiology, et cetera, et cetera. And I would definitely continue that. Now, in the short run, because I've been talking to colleagues there, is that one needs to find some money. I mean, the government of Kenya will have to reallocate some of its funding to health. Because, of course, and I would do the same if I were the Minister of Health, when there's foreign money that is paying for something that is essential, then you say, okay, fine, I don't have to spend my money there, I can, because the needs are enormous. We need to, provide electricity to everybody or to do what. So that will have to be done. But I would say also have a look, a cold and hard look at the whole service delivery systems, which when they're paid for by international money, are usually far more expensive than if they are organized by local entities. And that's an exercise that I know in Kenya is being happened. I mean, it's just as simple. For example, in Kenya, a lot of the antiretrovirals and TB drugs are in the central pharmacy facility, but PEPFAR was paying for getting them to the clinics and all that. And so it's kind of, a lot is logistics and all that. So I would say looking at all these so-called details can really make a difference. But, and then in the long term, I think where there is need for health financing, I think the international development banks will become far more important. But Kenya is economically and so on in a much better situation than some other countries. And you also have a fantastic local capacity. It's not because I hate the term capacity building. It's as if there's no capacity. Kenya has incredible capacity. I was at the University of Nairobi in the 80s and so on. I mean, even then. So I think for Kenya, I'm quite optimistic, as long as it's done with good accountability and good governance and not too much corruption, and you listen also to the communities. So, all the best. Ms. Michel.
Okay, I think we have one last question, and then we'll wrap up, although we'll have the opportunity to meet with Professor Piot at the reception.
Hi, Peter, again. Question. So the Pandemic Preparedness Treaty was signed a couple hours ago with like 124 or 5 countries, obviously without the U.S. Do you think this is going to move the needle at all in pandemic preparedness, and if so, how?
Yeah, I think that you heard what I said. I think that it's necessary to have it. It's like the international health regulations, where it sets a number of not only principles, but ways of exchanging information. But there are big pieces that are not yet agreed, as you know. I think I'm afraid that in cases of acute crisis, when there is, again, shortage, and let's not forget, scarcity is the enemy of equity. And when there's very few things available that save lives, and where you need 1 million more times, I don't think that any treaty will make any difference. But I know I'll be criticized for saying that, but that's the reality. However, the treaty is important because it will really, it sets standards, and I think a lot of countries will probably behave and will try to follow it. It's unfortunate that, the US is no longer in there, and not everybody will, agree to it, that's for sure. But I think it's, for me, what's important is that dialogue continues. Some people say, oh, it takes so long, but, I think it was Bill Clinton who was, when someone said, oh, in the Security Council, all they do is talk. He said, as long as we talk, we don't kill each other. And so we have to, that dialogue has to continue, and it's a key function of WHO to bring everybody together. And I hope that the US will be part of it, even if you can also be no longer a member of WHO, but still be engaged in this kind of conversations, I hope. It's in the interest of everybody.
Great.
On that note of the peaceful promise of dialogue, I'd like to thank Peter and Ami for their wonderful dialogue. I think there's going to be a reception right outside following us. But really, let's give everybody just a round of applause.